All right, welcome friends to podcast 17. You may notice if you're watching at home, we've got new executive high back chairs. We've also got some new decoration in our podcast studio, the Hawk Eye. We are both still very full from Thanksgiving. It is a balmy 71 degrees here in Dallas, Texas, and we are ready to pod. Welcome to the pod 17. If you remember back in pod 13, we talked a little bit about the end user and different things they want to think about when they're going through a co-location process. And so today we're going to do a little bit deeper dive on really just the process of that and seeing like, hey, what's some things we've seen people do to be successful during that process. So what we call is there's 4 real stages of that, like the requirements process or stage, request, review, and then realization. So we're going to walk through those stages and just talk about, again, some things we can do to be successful at each part of those stages. David, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say just for those that are listening that maybe don't know, before Data Center Hawk, this is what I used to do, is help companies walk through this process. And I think just from my perspective, it is a process that can be very challenging and one that you can find yourself wishing that you maybe had done some things on the front end to be helpful. That would produce a better result down the road. And I think when companies go through this, you just don't want to get to the end and go, oh, I wish we would have, And so I think the hope today from what Mike was saying is that you can hear of the steps that you need to go to be successful and things you can do along the way to make sure that when you get to the end, it's a good process.
Absolutely. And, one of the things you and I both have maybe helped some folks who are earlier in their marriage work through some stuff when we talk about the value of setting expectations.
Yeah.
And clearly setting them and then stating them and making sure that they're realistic.
Yeah.
So one of the things that this pod will do is help set some expectations around the co-location process.
Just building frameworks that you can know what's to be expected. And then also a lot of people that do this have never done it before. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to seem that way, but also you want to make sure you're representing your company in the best way and making really good decisions.
Great. All right, so let's talk about phase 1 or stage 1 requirements and really just thinking through, wanting to be intentional with, why it is you're doing this project, what's driving it. Is it new application? Is it disaster recovery? Is it a financial decision? Again, you can go back and listen to Pod 13. We kind of talked through each of those. But I think it's important just to write those down and like we talked about, then getting buy-in from the stakeholders as far as what will success look like for this project.
Yeah, and that's really important. Just having the right people at the table. I think maybe in podcast 13 we might have talked about that, but this is not a decision to be made in isolation. And what happens is one pitfall that can take place is you build one team in the company builds a framework and then starts to execute on that all the way down the end, and they get to the end, they realize, wait a minute, we need to add people back into this to actually pull the trigger. And then when they walk through that, when they add those groups back in, those groups have questions, they have different perspectives, and so that can really set this whole process and the time that you've spent doing this, can really be wasted. And so to Mike's point, having the right people at the table at the beginning of this needs analysis process is really important.
And we've seen folks have the most success start the process with a clear understanding of what they need and buy-in from those groups.
Yep.
So again, next thing to kind of think through is timing. Like when would this ideally take place? And I think that's where we see maybe the most fluidity, where folks will come through our site, they'll go through this process, they'll even go through get quotes, get pricing from providers, and then say, okay, you know what, great, we're probably going to wait another 6 months.
Yep.
We might wait another 9 months. And so understanding, I think this is true on the provider side and the user side, is that timing can be extremely fluid.
Yeah,
and doing everything you can to account for that in the process.
Yeah, these are long projects, a lot of people involved, a lot of opinions, and so decision making can be delayed. There's different business objectives that come up that delay the process. So I would just say traditionally plan that this project will take longer than you think it will.
Sure. And then next will be like, hey, where are we going to go?
Right.
And again, we see most folks, especially at the smaller, size co-location deals, their primary driver is location. So if they're have the space here, they want to be as close to that space as they possibly can be, just from an ease of movement and ease of management. So One of the things we've got is just the ability to go on our site, literally look at any market, search, drill down, and say, hey, who's there? What do these facilities look like? You can say, here's where I am, and easily see, who's around there, and just get an understanding of what the different options are in that physical geography.
Yeah, it's good.
All right, so that's really phase one, requirements, and just again understanding, taking an inventory. What is it? Socrates said, "Know thyself, know thy infrastructure."
Getting deep. I love this.
And so phase two is just the request process, and so I think that's probably a big question mark for a lot of people. Again, like you said, if you've never done it before, you probably go online, you might search Colocation in Dallas, right? That's an easy Google search, and you may get a bunch of provider pages come up, and see, sometimes folks have an email address, or a web form you can fill out. Some have a phone number you can call. Some have a request a quote, process you can go through on our site, and so that is one way to do it. You can physically call people. You may tap your network of other colleagues that you've got in the IT space, and say, hey, where are you guys co-locating at?
And I would just say that traditionally, when I started doing this however long ago, that's typically how things happen. It was and what happened was, the capital that was going into people or companies making this decision, so the money that companies were spending, and the strategic nature to which the infrastructure supported within the business required a much more thorough process than, hey, I have a buddy, he's done some work with this data center operator, I think they're the group for us. That's not a good, if that's your method, I would just say, that's not good to take to up the chain at your company to get approval to go do a deal like that. It has to be a much more thorough process, which is what you're outlining. And this is, your typical, trying to define the universe of what the options are. And there's several ways to do this. I think when we started our company, the goal was like, hey, how can we save people time? And, how can we get the universe defined quicker so that decisions can be made faster and from a more educated process?
Great. And again, there is an option. You could enlist the help of a professional, which is your prior role.
Yeah, and there's and I just say real quick, there are commercial real estate brokers that focus, all they do is focus on data center transactions. There are consultants from a strategy level that can help pull this off. From a telecom side of things, there are people that have done this for a career, and they are really good. And I would encourage companies to think about employing some of these people to be helpful, because it can certainly help prevent some headaches along the way.
Yeah, and then the other option would be enlist some technological help, which is again one of the things we've built into our site is the ability to go through that process, define what your location requirements are, what your size requirements are, connectivity requirements, etc., and then see a list of folks who can help you, a list of providers who meet your requirements and can meet, and have said we have a relationship with, and we know that they would take that quote, respond to that
quickly
quote.
Respond, and that's a big part of it too. Sending in web forms on an email for a huge company, it can feel like you're getting lost into the sea of who that company is, and will they even know what I'm doing? And I don't think that's necessarily the case, but it certainly can feel that way. And I think we've, obviously spent our time developing some tools that can help make that faster, connect you with the right people, and get you moving in the right direction quicker.
Yep. And so again, trying to remove as much friction as we can from the request process, then moving into phase 3, the review process. Once that request has been submitted, 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, a provider is going to want to speak to you over the phone before they, issue you a quote. They're going to just ask some additional clarifying questions typically around timing or the nature of the space or what's driving the process. And so I would say just be prepared to ask some questions. What we've tried to do is make our tool as simple as possible, just to, again, expedite that process. But there will be a follow-up. And then, typically we see anywhere from 3 to 10 business days, folks responding and then providing a quote. So again, once you've got quotes in front of you, pieces of paper in front of you with different providers' pricing for you, it's important to understand, hey, how to read these. And that's where, some real intentional organization can come into play as far as we've seen, providers send a sheet with literally 2 numbers on it. The setup fee, or the NRC, non-recurring charge, and the MRC, or the monthly recurring charge. 2 numbers, that's it, all in. We've seen other folks break it out and say, here's what you're paying for the space of the cabinet, here's what you're paying for the power, here's what you're paying for the redundancy of the power, connectivity, et cetera, et cetera. So it's helpful it can take time to just compare some of those apples to apples. So Dave, I know, again, you just spend a lot of time doing that.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add to that specific part of the process?
This is probably, the most important part, if not the planning part, but this is just the understanding. And it can get challenging because you are getting a lot of information back. And I would just caution maybe users today that are out there thinking, hey, let's get as many people to bid on this project as we can. Like, at some point, in my opinion, too many companies in the process creates more harm than it does good. And so as an example, if you have a 1 cabinet requirement and you're trying to figure out where that goes, you can get 20 companies to give you a bid on what that is. However, it's really hard to differentiate, that process. And once you get all that information, you need to compare it. And so I found the best way to do that is to kind of come in with maybe 6 to 8 different groups, ask for pricing, and then, then go back to the 3 that are the most interesting to you. And I think from a business perspective, I think the provider, I think you'll actually do better if that's your approach. And to your point, the reason that data center operators want to talk to users is because they're really trying to validate the opportunity. A lot of times what they will tell you is, they have worked with users that believe they've done their needs analysis, the user has. They believe the requirement is X, but when they talk with the provider, the reality is they can make that X requirement, or they can shrink it based off of higher densities, doing different things with the space. And so they can actually make just through the conversation, understanding what the requirement is, they can make it more efficient. I would say I don't think that's the case with every user. And there's a lot of users on this that don't want to talk to the provider. And I think we get that. And that's one of the reasons we created this platform that allows you to reach out quickly and faster and get information quicker. But I think, too, the only other things that I would add here is you've got to think today, but you also have to think tomorrow. So when you're looking at this, what you've gotten back, you have to think, hey, they're solving my needs today. What are my needs potentially tomorrow, and could they solve them as well? This is a long-term relationship. So the idea that, hey, we're going to put our cabinet and we're going to run circuits and we're going to put a cage up and we're going to be here for 18 months traditionally does not happen. Like most users invest so much in the space, invest so much in the network from a capital perspective that you're going to spend a lot of time with that provider. The other thing I'd say is the least expensive choice is not always the best choice. So you get what you pay for, and that's, I think, an important thing in this industry.
Yeah, and what you mentioned about just being maybe being open to suggestion, basically, and that these data center operators are experts. And I think a specific example is we were talking to a provider the other day, and they said, hey, you may come in and look for a space, and it's whatever $1,000 a month for a cabinet of space, and all that goes along with that. Or they have basically a rent the hardware approach, and I think it's like $5K a month.
Sure.
Don't quote me on that, but
different.
There's
I know I'm quoting you on that.
That number, those numbers, hey, $5K a month versus
Yes.
$1K a month seems like very disparate
Yes.
numbers. However, the long-term model might be more beneficial for the
Yes.
company to say, hey, we're going to spend $5,000 a month, but we don't have to buy any hardware.
Right. And if you've done your needs analysis right, your requirement section that Mike talked about at the beginning, the reality is you can hear that and go, oh, wait, maybe this is interesting to us. And I think the last thing I was just thinking through was, one thing I would always put in, my mind if I'm going through the review process is who can we trust? Once we've gotten through the numbers and all these different things, who can we trust to do business with for a long period of time? This is as I mentioned before, a lot of money is spent on these projects, and it's significantly important for the organization, like where this goes, who it's with, how they operate the space. And so you have got to just internally be able to think through, if things get bad, if we go through challenges with the facility, our network, challenges we have as a company, who is a company that we want to work with for a long period of time. And I can't stress that enough. because every one of these, I mean, if you've done one of these projects before, you're probably laughing because they all have problems. There's no perfect, project from start to finish. They all have challenges. So you want to be partnered with someone that you really feel like you can trust for a long period of time.
Yeah, that's a good point about, there's the kind of the pre-sale move-in type, timeline. And then there's everything that happens after that, the next 3 to 20 years.
Yes.
And so I think it is really a marriage in a lot of ways, and that you want to know who you're,
right.
Yoking with. And
absolutely.
so I think, again, one of the exhortations we would give is learn as much as you can about, hey, what happens when I need to switch out a server? What happens when I need to do X, Y, and Z? What does that process look like? Is there a platform I can do it online? Is there remote hands? Can I get in there and do it myself?
Yes.
And again, I think all stuff that folks would ask, but, again, just something we see, it's something that can be missed. And so we would hate to see that missed. Let's spend just a second on connectivity, because I know that if you say, hey, I need 100 megabytes or megabits of bandwidth, you can get that, and providers will typically provide that. But there are other options. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the connectivity story is becoming much more important to individual users and how they architect their networks to support their business. And so Mike brings up a good point in highlighting this. If you have a very small deployment, you can take advantage of the leverage the amount of providers that data center operators have coming into their space, and they have blended network offerings that they can provide to you, where you don't necessarily have to go out and have a specific contract with a fiber provider. So, but at a certain size, you would want to do that, and you'll have to run a similar process to an extent with those fiber providers that you've done with the data center operator. You've got to think, are these fiber providers within the facility already? If they're not, what's the timeline and cost to get them there? Do we have a relationship with the fiber provider today that we will want to make sure is there in the future? And so that's why tools like ours and others can be helpful to you to make sure that you don't miss that process along the way, because the network is a very important part. It will be a very important part. And as you think about how, and that's almost like the needs of tomorrow too, because as there's things that companies are going to want the network to do 3 years from now that they don't want it to do today. I don't know what those are. They don't know what those are. But you want to think through, am I in a facility that can navigate and provide for me the ability to connect to some of those things in the future? And I think that's just a really important thing to think through.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that's really stage 3, just reviewing all that information again. It just, I think there's a fallacy that you would buy this like you buy anything else. And I think what we've seen is that the buying process is much more involved, and it really requires some organization, some there's some intentionality to say, I'm gonna look at these and review them. And I think, again, just from where we're sitting, our viewpoint on the process is as much communication as you can, the better, even if it's still reviewing, still looking, respond to those emails. And again, it helps the providers know, what's going on as far as, hey, should they continue to, for lack of a better term, nag you about it, or should they just say, great, you went somewhere else, we'll move on.
And I think if you are looking for a way to understand who might be the best option, one suggestion I would have would be to build some sort of a scoring system based off of what is important to your organization. So if you've got to take the cheapest price back to your team, that's one way to build the analysis. I wouldn't recommend that, but that's one way. If you have to make sure you have plans for today and tomorrow covered in what you're bringing back, that's one way to build it. If you have to think through, U.S. footprint versus international footprint, I mean, there are just so many ways that you can build that so that you do have a good picture. And you can, again, if somebody audits the process and say, hey, tell me why we chose this provider in this market with this footprint, you can say, here it is. This is what we did. We built the requirements. We requested the info. We put it into a matrix. We reviewed it. And this was the result that we came to.
All right, so that is phase 3. So phase 4 is realization or relocation or execution. I like my R's. So again, you've gone through this whole process.
Yes.
You said, okay, here we go, ready to sign. So what happens after that? Talk about it this way. So happy path, right? If everything goes right,
Yes.
what happens after that? And then what are some things that folks can be aware of that could go wrong and how to possibly mitigate those?
Absolutely. So at that moment when a deal, or a transaction is completed and the data center user, the company has signed the documents needed to formalize the process, formalize the agreement, they're going to complete a kickoff meeting with the data center operator where you will talk through how the space will be constructed or built, how the move-in process will take place. And I would say, in my experience, the data center operator community has really done a good job at managing this project. This is not their first rodeo. They've done this before. So they have an internal process and team that works on these projects. But challenges can arise. And so that's why I say, this is the moment where you figure out, hey, did we do our due diligence on the front end? And is this really the company that we thought it was? And you see that firsthand, right in those meetings and in the execution of getting the space ready to be, moved in. Some companies today are still migrating, existing data center infrastructure on the, office buildings that they own out into colocation facilities. And some of those applications are moving to cloud, but that's certainly, is happening today still. And so, that's typically what happens. Then, the end user will have responsibilities in getting their gear in the space. And then, and I would just say this, if you're a data center operator and you're listening to this, I think you would agree that most of the time, the data center operator is waiting on the user. Typically it's not the user pushing the provider. It can be as far as like let's get this going, but once they get going, they can move pretty quickly. And then that's the process. Then they get their space going, or they essentially will get their servers moved in, turned on, and then they start the process where the space is lit and going.
Yeah. So, and what are some things you've seen possibly go wrong with that process where that could have been mitigated with some forethought or some communication up front?
Yeah. I think sometimes like the layout of the environment is an important thing to think about. One of the trends that we've seen in the data center industry in the last 5 years has been more dense environments. That's the worst way to say that. Like higher density environments. That's the way to say it. And so what you've seen is the data center operator community really pushing for that, because if they can get higher densities, they can sell more. And it also allows the user to grow in their footprint. And so this is a big change, because typically data center users have wanted, 3 to 5 kW per cabinet. And you can only put so many cabinets in a certain amount of space with that density. But if you can dense up those cabinets, you can, grow in place. And that's of huge value to the provider, because they can sell more and don't have to extend the environment, the physical environment. And it's a big, potentially, advantage for the customer, because they're just then adding servers. But it is the planning of that down the road. And so there's just some thought that needs to go into that. But that's one of the things that can be a challenge. Another thing that can be a challenge is just ensuring you have the right people to help you do more than, having the right cabling help. If you walk through certain data centers, you see where that's done really well, and you also see where that's done really poorly. So I think there's a lot of thought with that can be on the front end that can go a long way down the road. So those are just some of the things that can help make sure that process goes well.
Got it. All right. So making sure you've got your layout, planned,
Yep.
and that the operator's on board with
Yep.
that. I want to put 1 kilowatt per cabinet across 5 cabinets.
Yeah, that's
probably not a good
plan.
plan.
That's a problem.
And then, understanding if you're going to need some additional maybe contractor help to come in with the cabling, getting that lined up as well.
And I think companies, if they will dedicate like a project manager to that process, and I've seen I can think of a financial company that at the end of the day was about a 300 or 400 kW. That was their footprint. And they had, there's a woman on their team, and she was phenomenal. Probably the best I've seen as far as going, this is our timeline. This This is what we've committed to. We're going to hit these dates. Let's move. And I think if you have someone on that like that internally for your company that is the boss that can help get things done and really owns the process, that is a huge part of it.
Sure. As we know, planning to fail or failing to plan is planning to fail.
That's
so
right.
Have a plan. And we talked about plans in prior podcasts. All right, so that's phase 4, realization or relocation. So that is the 4th phase. We hope this has been helpful. Again, we have done a lot of work to help this process. Again, some of the tools on our site are really designed to help this process make these decisions as informed as possible, as quickly as possible. So we'll post some links to that in the show notes. But anything else before we wrap up, David?
No, it's been fascinating to watch this process change over, time, and users become, much more efficient. It's if there's anything I've seen in my experience in the space, it's been, just that the data center user is maturing. But with that maturing comes, requirement needs and changes in how they approach their IT infrastructure environment. And so I think this is a phenomenal process when done well, but it really stings when it's not. And that's where I'd say if you're a user, you've really got to do your homework on the front end. It's a bit painful on the front end, but you gain a lot on the back end if you do it right.
Good stuff. Again, thanks for listening. We will catch you on podcast 18.